Televizija BN.
Night after night, television brought images of death and suffering from the war that engulfed Yugoslavia between 1991 and 1995. When the fighting stopped, NATO countries, particularly the United States, eagerly claimed credit for ending the war. The lesson learned, many said, was that there should be early intervention in ethnic conflicts, and preferably by NATO. But did the West prematurely take credit for ending a war it had helped create? Did misguided Western intervention actually transform a small brush fire in the Balkans into a major civil war?
I think that what the international community on the whole, the Europeans and the Americans and the United Nations have done, on the whole, made it sure there was going to be a conflict.
The intelligence community was unanimous in saying that if we go ahead and recognize Bosnia, it will blow up.
Because there was no agreed branches and because everybody was armed, if you ruptured the old Yugoslavia by unilaterally declaring independence, in fact, seceding was a war of secession. Once you decided to secede, you had no hope that it could be done peacefully.
Early 1990 had brought a brief moment of hope and optimism to Europe as the Berlin Wall crumbled and the Cold War ground to a halt. A newly united Germany stood poised to unite the rest of Europe through its leadership of the European Community, a friendly but powerful rival to the United States. But the promise of European unity was short-lived. Just 2 years later, much of Yugoslavia was in flames. A small war in the Slovenian Republic led to larger, more bloody conflicts in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Moreover, European nations, the United States, and Middle Eastern states were backing different factions in these outbreaks of civil war. Publicly, Western diplomats blamed irresponsible ethnic leaders of the different Yugoslav republics for the bloodshed, including Milan Kucan of Slovenia, Franjo Tudjman of Croatia, and especially Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia. There was certainly no innocence among the warring parties. Privately, however, European Community envoy Lord Carrington and UN mediator Cyrus Vance were furious at Germany's foreign minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher. Vance would later call the conflict Mr. Genscher's War because of Germany's push to recognize separatists in Slovenia and Croatia.
Vance argued that recognition would take away the diplomatic leverage that he had to try to bring the conflict in Croatia to an end and could possibly result in Bosnia blowing up.
The former German foreign minister claimed that his government did not support the breakup of Yugoslavia until fighting began.
We held a strong position for the unity of Yugoslavia, as I said, but we saw that the will to keep it together vanished more and more under the pressure of military events.
In fact, however, since the 1960s, Germany's intelligence arm, the BND, was deeply involved in the training of Croatian separatists, led by the pro-Nazi Ustashi who fled to Germany after World War II, and participated in a number of terrorist actions against embassies and the government of Yugoslav communist leader Josip Broz Tito.
In the early 60s, the BND decided to cooperate fully with the Ustasha. This became plain to see after the so-called Croat Spring in the beginning of the 70s. After Tito's death, they accelerated their efforts, together with the Ustasha, in order to disintegrate Yugoslavia into several smaller states.
Germany's crucial role in supporting Croatian separatists is confirmed by Anton Duhacek, the former director of Yugoslav counterintelligence, who was himself a Croat.
The Germans wanted an absolute and complete subordination of Croatian intelligence that would carry out all that the Germans wanted. And the Germans promised that this would be in the interest of the future independent, free Croatia.
On the surface, Yugoslavia seemed better off than its East European neighbors in the 1970s and 80s. The U.S. considered its independent communist leader, Josip Broz Tito, an asset in the Cold War with Moscow. Yugoslavia's economy was propped up with Western loans even after Tito's death in 1980. The carefully staged 1984 Olympics in Sarajevo offered the world the impression of a peaceful, multi-ethnic country working together. Veteran observers, however, could see trouble below the surface.
I think the first hint I got of a violent breakup was when I made a tour of all of the republics in 1983, and I heard a lot of sort of separatist sentiments in several of the republics, especially Slovenia and Croatia, but not only. And some very threatening remarks were made in the course of my conversations about what we would do to them and so on.
By themselves, neither Slovenia nor Croatia had the diplomatic or military power to actually separate, to challenge Yugoslavia's federal army, which was the fourth largest in Europe. But Germany provided not only diplomatic support, but also weapons, even after an international arms embargo.
And I wrote a story about it, which was called "The Blockade's a Joke." And so I went and started checking the ports, like Split and the ports along the Dalmatian coast, and as best I could, checking the stuff that was coming across the borders, and there was no limitations.
We saw a Croatian MiG-21 shot down in the Krajina, which the Croatians said came from former Yugoslav Air Force stocks. In fact, it was clearly from East German Air Force stocks. It had the East German radar warning receivers on board. So we know that these weapons are coming from the former East German stocks, so that they're, if you like, slightly disguised in the sense that they don't look like West German weapons, but they are coming from West Germany, obviously with the West German government's blessing. There can be no other way in which heavy weapons can be supplied like this.
While separatist forces were being armed, Germany was, at the same time, warning the Yugoslav government of Ante Marković not to use force against separatists. Ante Marković, who was himself a Croatian, presided over a divided government which was unable to stand up to German pressure or rally his government for the challenges ahead.
He never lined up, coalition support. He always flew solo. So, he could be welcomed in the White House, and was, but he didn't have any backing at home. So, in that sense, he was a real failure, and a disastrous one in that he preserved the fiction that Yugoslavia was holding together.
The Yugoslav Federal Army, which held the country together, now became a target for those who wanted to break it apart. At a Croatian separatist rally in Split in May of 1991, demonstrators strangled a young soldier of the Federal Army and then tossed his dead body onto the street. This and similar events seem to bear out predictions by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency.
The CIA said in 1990, October, that Yugoslavia faced breakup, probably violent, as early as 6 months from the time of the report. And nobody paid any attention to it in the higher echelons of government.
By June of 1991, however, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker decided to make one attempt to prevent a disaster. He flew to Belgrade, the capital of Yugoslavia, to confront leaders of the 6 republics.
He said, don't any of you take steps that are not agreed on by the others.
However, Milan Kučan and Franjo Tuđman, leaders of the Slovenian and Croatian republics, were confident that they could ignore the U.S. Secretary of State. They declared their independence just days later, on June 25th, because they could count on the support of German Foreign Minister Genscher and Austrian Foreign Minister Alois Mock. The cycle of violence which would destroy Yugoslavia began when Slovene President Milan Kučan ordered his troops to seize customs posts on the Yugoslav borders with Austria and Italy and the Slovene capital of Ljubljana. Yugoslav flags were taken down and replaced with Slovenian flags.
And the Slovenes thought they had a right to take down those flags. The end of an internationally recognized frontier. And I don't think that for a moment Belgrade expected there would be violent resistance.
To avoid violence, Yugoslav Army General Andrija Rašeta had phoned Milan Kučan privately to let him know that many Yugoslav Army troops responding to this challenge of federal authority were not even carrying live ammunition.
But in fact, the Slovenes had prepared themselves. They were getting a lot of encouragement from across the way, from Vienna and from the Germans too. And they foresaw that they could make a very big international case by having what they called a war of independence. It was nothing of the sort.
German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher flew to the Austrian border with Yugoslavia to join President Kučan and warned the Federal Army against efforts to maintain control of federal borders. Kučan ordered his forces to fire on Yugoslav Army troops, including those who carried no live ammunition. Faced with international opposition led by Germany, Yugoslav President Marković ordered the Federal Army to withdraw from Slovenia without a serious attempt to counter separatist forces. Slovene leaders conducted a masterful public relations effort. Foreign reporters were kept occupied in an underground press center with briefings that suggested that Slovene forces had defeated the fourth largest army in Europe. Journalists in the press center routinely reported as news fanciful briefings from Slovene officials on various battles, including some that had never happened.
What was going on in Slovenia, where the Slovenians declared independence and set up customs posts on the road, tended to be seen and portrayed on television as the Yugoslav army acting aggressively against Slovenia as opposed to the Slovenians declaring independence.
The manipulation of the foreign press corps set the tone for new wars of secession in Croatia and Bosnia. Repeatedly, the JNA was described as an occupying force dominated by Serbs. The reality was different, however. The Army's Chief of Staff, Veljko Kadijević, was half Croatian, half Serb. Air Force Chief Zvonko Jurjević was Croatian, and the commander of the Navy, Stane Brovec, was Slovenian.
And the Federal Army had held Yugoslavia together under Tito without creating any protests about human rights. Tito insisted on an ethnic balance, and in the localities it was composed of the people of that area. It was absurd to call it an army of occupation. And we, the West, should have recognized it until there was an agreed arrangement for a dissolution of a state which had been Yugoslavia and which might take years or decades or perhaps be impossible. Until then, it had to be recognized these were the internationally recognized frontiers.
If German and Austrian leaders still believed that Slovenia and Croatia could be separated from Yugoslavia without a wider war, the Americans strongly believed otherwise.
Because we said, if Yugoslavia does not break up peacefully, there's going to be one hell of a civil war. It nevertheless broke up non-peacefully. It broke up through the unilateral declaration of independence by Slovenia and Croatia and the seizing by these two countries, republics, of their border posts, which was an act of force and which was an act that was in violation of the Helsinki principles. But the European powers and the United States ultimately recognized Slovenia and then Croatia and then Bosnia as independent countries as and admitted them to the United Nations. The real problem was that there was a unilateral declaration of independence and a use of force to gain that independence rather than a peaceful negotiation of independence, which is the way it should have happened.
While most of Europe, including England, France, and Russia, opposed the breakup of Yugoslavia, only the Americans were strong enough to oppose Germany. In a decision that would have far-reaching consequences, however, the Americans decided to back away from this challenge. George Kenny, who would later resign in protest over policy, was running the U.S. State Department's Yugoslavia desk at the time.
Our marching orders were to keep the U.S. out, to avoid taking any responsibility for a solution to the conflict. The analysts could see that the problem would get a lot worse. They also saw that the Europeans weren't going to be able to handle it.
Historically, the United States had supported a multi-ethnic Yugoslavia over a 70-year period to stabilize the region and serve as a barrier to German expansion. In reality, Yugoslavia, a union of South Slavic peoples, would never have come together in 1918 without American support from U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. For centuries, the region had been colonized by Austro-Hungary and the Turkish Ottoman Empire. The Austrians, under the Habsburg monarchy, used a policy of divide and rule to maintain control, keeping the Slovenes, Croatians, Serbs, and Muslims at each other's throats, instead of uniting them in their common interests.
The Habsburg Empire kept going and held down a large part of what we came to call Yugoslavia, and there was no possibility of a Slav get-together until after the First World War, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed and the peoples came together and decided to unite.
With American support, Yugoslavia was founded in 1918 and survived German attempts to divide it up during World War II. When Yugoslavia's communist leader Josip Broz Tito broke away from the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc in 1948, the U.S. stepped in with military assistance as well as international loans to prop up a buffer state between the West and the communist-dominated Warsaw Pact. As the Cold War came to an end, however, Washington declared a new world order which emphasized economic competition rather than anti-communism.
So once that containment of the Soviet Union began to disappear as a need with the decline after mid-80s, Gorbachev's economic reforms, the NATO Warsaw Pact, talks about reducing arms and force buildup, all of that led to Yugoslavia being essentially irrelevant in its defense posture. And by early 1989, the Americans were really quite explicit. The new ambassador to Yugoslavia from the United States informed the Yugoslav government that the Yugoslav position was no longer needed, that Yugoslavia was no longer strategically important to the United States and Western defense.
Yugoslavia had become expendable. International loans were called in, causing triple-digit inflation. The federal government was forced to require austerity measures from the different republics.
Particularly those requirements led Slovenia as a republic and eventually other republics to rebel against what was being called economic reform in the constitutional level.
Any American efforts to preserve Yugoslavia would also put Washington on a collision course with Germany when German leaders were enjoying their first taste of real political power since World War II. Moreover, U.S. President George Bush had declared a special relationship with Germany, the kind America used to have with England.
The United States thought that Germany would have to be largely responsible for the incorporation of Eastern Europe and Central Europe into the West, because Germany had a national interest, it was its neighbor, its periphery, and it was financially the most powerful country in Europe and had the resources to do it.
In the post-Cold War period, Germany wanted, once again, the evidence is very clear, to recolonize Yugoslavia, to recolonize the Balkans. And the United States tied itself to German policy through its need of German power and influence in stabilizing Eastern Europe, Western Europe, through the exercise of dominion via the European Community, now the European Union, and potentially, eventually, in the lands of the former Soviet Union. The problem was that there was one very important country standing in the way of this, and that was Yugoslavia.
While citizens of Croatia were initially divided over whether to remain in Yugoslavia, the separatists were led by the most extreme elements, remnants of the pro-Nazi Ustaše.
Ja bih vas pozdravio i rekao, samo na posljednji možete imati zajedništvo. Hvala lijepa.
As the New York Times columnist A.M. Rosenthal would write, in World War II, Hitler had no executioners more willing, no ally more passionate than the fascists of Croatia. They are returning from 50 years ago from what should have been their eternal grave, the defeat of Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler considered Yugoslavia to be an artificial creation of the hated Versailles Treaty, which ended World War I. To break it up, he set up a puppet state and enlarged Croatia, which also included Bosnia-Herzegovina. As its leader, he appointed the fanatical Croat Ustashi Ante Pavelić. Pavelić had helped plot the assassination of King Alexander, Yugoslavia's first constitutional monarch, in Marseille, France in 1934.
And it was the Germans, the German Nazis, who picked out this dreadful Ustashi leader who had made quite clear that he favoured Hitler's solution to be applied, which Hitler's his final solution for the Jews he wanted to apply to the Serbs, so he made no secret of it.
Simon Wiesenthal, who tracked Ustashi fugitives for decades, along with other Nazi war criminals, told an interviewer,
I must admit I am obsessed by the criminal character of the independent state of Croatia. Even the Germans were appalled by the crimes committed in it.
How many men, women, and children died there? Hitler's special envoy to the Balkans, Hermann Neubacher, wrote, leaders of the Ustashi boast that they have slaughtered 1 million Orthodox Serbs. On the basis of official German reports, I estimate the number to be 750,000. Most of these Serbian civilians perished in the notorious Croatian death camp Jasenovac, which straddled the Sava River between Croatia and Bosnia. The extermination of Serbs, Jews, and Gypsies in Sarajevo was the task of top Muslim leaders who, with few exceptions, collaborated with Hitler and the Croatians.
There was in occupied Bosnia, also under German patronage, a strong Muslim wing which was very anti-Western. It was represented internationally by the Mufti of Jerusalem. You heard of his viciously anti-Western views, and he was brought to Sarajevo and mobbed by enthusiastic crowds.
After the war ended, Croatia and Bosnia were never denazified. Not only were there no apologies to the Serbs, Jews, and Gypsies, but attitudes remained frozen under the surface of Tito's official policy of socialist fraternity amongst peoples. Following the death of Yugoslavia's longtime leader, Tito, in 1980, right-wing émigré organizations took out an advertisement on the opinion page of the New York Times, stating that Yugoslavia would not survive, and offering a map which included all of Bosnia as part of Croatia. It was a map nearly identical to the Nazi-created independent state of Croatia. By 1990, as communism was collapsing in Eastern Europe, Croatian separatists pinned their hopes on a former communist general named Franjo Tuđman, who had been jailed for excessive nationalism by Tito in the 1970s.
You know, I met him very soon after he came out of communist jail, while Tito was still alive. He had then championed the racialist nationalist form of nationalism, and when he came out of prison, instead of doing what you would think a dissident would do and say, to hell with the communists, he said, oh, well, it's nothing to do with the regime. It's those horrible Serbs who are oppressing us, and the Serbs are responsible for everything, and the Serbs are guilty, and the Serbs have done it all.
Tuđman received important help from outside of Croatia in his rise to power.
The German Secret Service was enormously active in Croatia and in all of Yugoslavia, trying in the 80s to build bridges between what were called the national communists, Stipe Mesić, Franjo Tuđman, in Yugoslavia, and the Ustasha revanchist organizations which lived in the diaspora of Croatia, that is to say, all of the people of weight and influence who had fled the former Nazi puppet state in 1945.
Tuđman found it useful to come to terms with them, and because he was running on this xenophobic platform, there was really no difficulty about it. What was difficult was when he was trying to sell his cause in the West, and he managed to, partly because he had a very good lobby, very effective and much more effective than the Serbian lobby, and partly because he covered up his intentions.
Tudjman often embarrassed his most important supporters, such as German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. For instance, Tudjman had written a book minimizing the crimes of the Ustashi and claiming that the Holocaust was greatly exaggerated. "Thank God my wife is neither a Serb nor a Jew," he told one interviewer. For the national flag, Tudjman chose a replica of the checkerboard emblem that flew over the Croatian death camps of World War II, where Serbs, Jews, and Gypsies were exterminated. Tudjman's anti-Semitic views were covered beneath rhetoric acceptable to the West. With the help of Reuter and Finn, a high-powered American public relations firm, the New York Times found space for General Tudjman's new and misleading image on its opinion page. In the article, Tudjman promised that there would be no purges against the Serbian population in Croatia if it separated from Yugoslavia.
Tudjman declared that Croatia was for the Croats. That was his slogan, a racialist slogan. Croatia for the Croats, with the implication people who weren't Croats, and there was a very substantial Serb and Yugoslav mixed variety, didn't feel that they had any, they were in fact second-class citizens, and he recognized them as such.
A full 6 months before fighting broke out, Serbs were purged from positions in government, news organizations, and the police. Their homes were dynamited in cities such as Zagreb, Zadar, and Dubrovnik. For the first time since World War II, Serbs in eastern Croatia began to flee across the Danube River.
Serbs working in Croatian cities were required to sign loyalty oaths. Those who did not sign were fired. Those who did sign were fired later. Serb homes, apartments, and businesses were attacked.
Predsjednik Republike Hrvatske, gospodin Franjo Tuđman, dao nam je odobrenje da po prvi put formiramo nenaoružane odrede civilne zaštite Hrvatske demokratske zajednice.
Any doubt that Tudjman himself issued orders for the expulsion of Serbs in Croatia was removed by Tomislav Merčep, a senior member of Tudjman's ruling party, the HDZ. Merčep would later be identified by Croatian police reports as one of 2 Croatian leaders who directed death squads that murdered hundreds of Serbian civilians in eastern Slavonia around Vukovar and Osijek in the fall of 1991. He received little press coverage in the West, but Merčep was, in many ways, the spark that set the fire of war in Slavonia, a disputed region of Croatia where the Yugoslav war began. Merčep's co-leader of the Croatian death squads was Branimir Glavaš of Osijek. Unlike more discreet members of the ruling HDZ party, Glavaš made no secret of his identification with the World War II Croatian Ustashi as he welcomed returning Croatian prisoners of war. While some French intellectuals were hailing Croatia as part of the new Europe, old and familiar forces were at work. Osijek became a magnet for neo-fascist groups fighting with Glavaš. They included British skinheads, German and Austrian neo-fascists, and followers of the French extremist Jean-Marie Le Pen.
C'est comme ça que l'on bâtit l'Europe nationaliste.
Et vous y allez directement après, demain?
Oui, demain nous partons pour Zagreb pour prendre des ordres à l'état-major, mais pas de l'armée croate régulière. Nous allons avec la force de défense croate qui dépend du parti du droit croate, et donc nous partirons quelque part sur le front en Slavonie, je suppose.
The United States, which soon adopted Germany's approach to the Balkans, ignored recent history and offered a simple explanation for the fighting which broke out in the predominantly Serbian region of Croatia, which was known as the Krajina. Assistant Secretary of State Richard Holbrooke, who spent the early years of the Yugoslav War as the American ambassador to Germany, represented what became the official American view.
The Serbs started this war. The Serbs are the original cause of the war.
Those who tried to prevent the war saw it differently.
The Serbs in Croatia, and indeed outside Croatia, had a very vivid memory of what happened in 1941-42, when Hitler declared Croatia as an independent puppet state, if you like, and the horrors that went on there and the murders of the Serbs were still a very large number of Serbs were murdered at that time. I mean, hundreds of thousands. And I think it was very understandable that when Croatia declared its independence and promulgated a new constitution without any safeguard for the 600,000 Serbs who still lived in Croatia, the Serbs were very perturbed about this.
From the beginning, the Serbs were blamed, and they were partly blamed out of ignorance because nobody bothered to look back at the history to put it within its historical context and to see why the Serbs who lived in Krajina and the Serbs who lived in the area that is called Bosnia-Herzegovina, why, because of their historical experiences, were so hostile to being under Zagreb or under Muslim Sarajevo rule.
In World War II, Serbs offered the first serious resistance to Nazi Germany on the mainland of Europe. Later in the war, the Serbian royalists, sometimes known as the Chetniks, organized the largest rescue of downed American pilots behind enemy lines. But U.S. relations with the Serbs deteriorated greatly by 1989, symbolized by the stormy relationship between Slobodan Milosevic, the new leader of Serbia, and Warren Zimmerman, the new U.S. ambassador to Yugoslavia.
I think Warren came out of Vienna from his last post as an ambassador dealing mainly with human rights, and his first action as ambassador was to go to Kosovo and embrace the Kosovo separatist leaders. And this automatically offended the relatively new Serbian leadership under Slobodan Milosevic.
By the late 1980s, ethnic unrest in Kosovo had already set the stage for the breakup of Yugoslavia. For Serbs who first inhabited the area in the 7th century AD, Kosovo was the cradle of their civilization, their Jerusalem, and home to their most revered monasteries.
A bit of history, unfortunately, is required here. The Albanians pushed Serbs out in the 19th century. The Serbs started pushing Albanians out around 1904. The Albanians surged back in World War II under Italian protection and pushed Serbs out.
When the war ended, however, Marshal Tito decided to keep the Serbian refugees from returning to their homes in Kosovo. As a result, Serbs lost their majority in the province.
Tito is very guilty of that particular drama of Kosovo. He made it much harder to solve, in fact, almost impossible.
To keep a restive Albanian population within the Yugoslav Federation, Tito's 1974 constitution gave Kosovo autonomy as a province of Serbia. However, the autonomy was badly abused by Tito's Albanian communist cadres, who permitted a campaign of violence to drive out the remaining Serbian population.
Life was made extremely difficult for the Serb minority, and it was here that the Kosovos began to push to have a pure, all Albanian, meaning racially pure, a Kosovo in the areas where there were very few Serbs anyhow. They were pushing them out, and the Serbs used the word that it was ethnic cleansing, and that's what it was.
Homes of Serbs were appropriated by Albanians. Orthodox Christian cemeteries and monasteries were desecrated. By the late 1980s, the Serbian population of Kosovo had gone from 50% at the start of World War II to just 10%. At this time, Slobodan Milosevic emerged as the voice of Serbian discontent over Kosovo. Seeking to consolidate his political base in his own republic, Milosevic also spoke for Serbian minorities living in Croatia and Bosnia who feared the emergence of hostile separatist regimes. A lifelong political opportunist, Milosevic was willing to provide limited military support to the Serbs of the Krajina as long as it suited his own agenda. The Serbian leader's maneuvers, however, deepened the chaos that accompanied the breakup of Yugoslavia.
I think he is enormously to blame for his treatment of Western powers from the beginning of 1991. He regarded them as the enemy and he would not talk to them.
While Serbia's president shunned meetings with the American ambassador, separatist leaders were receiving a sympathetic ear from Warren Zimmerman. The American ambassador and his boss, Assistant Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, largely ignored the provocations of separatists in Slovenia and Croatia, who were backed by Germany and focused solely on the Serbs.
The two of them adopted a stance that was, from day one, blaming the Serbs for just about everything. The Serbs were the target of all of the actions of the United States of America from the beginning.
So did American news organizations, whose foreign correspondents relied heavily on the U.S. Embassy for their reporting. Yet the obsessive focus of the press with Milosevic served to divert attention from the role of Western powers in making an avoidable war inevitable. While some Western leaders called Milosevic an architect of the conflict, the first shots of the war had been fired by armed separatists in Slovenia and Croatia, strongly supported by Germany. In hope of heading off disaster, the European Community organized a constitutional conference in 1991, led by respected British diplomat Lord Peter Carrington, to find a compromise between those who wanted to separate from Yugoslavia and those who wished to keep it together. The problem was that administrative borders, or internal frontiers, devised by Tito in 1943, left 1/3 of the Serbian population out of Serbia, mostly in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia.
These frontiers were drawn in a very secretive and very, in my view, very irresponsible way by Tito's inner cabinet while the war was still going on. And they were never subject to a public debate or discussion. They were never endorsed.
The idea of giving each republic substantial economic and political autonomy meant that each was a kind of hierarchy of the party, and then there was you had, in order to keep the country together, you had to balance out these political leaders. And Tito was very skillful in playing one off against the other, or in some cases of playing them against their population. It was the substitute for democracy in the way that we know it, but it was also considered by many of his supporters throughout the population as necessary because, to their view, democracy led to national, or as we call them, ethnic parties, and that would then break up the country and lead to civil war again.
As Yugoslavia slid toward civil war in 1991, 2 referendums were held on the same day in Croatia. Croatians voted overwhelmingly to separate from Yugoslavia, while ethnic Serbs, particularly those from the Krajina region, voted by a similar margin to remain within Yugoslavia. A compromise favored by European Community negotiators would have permitted Croatia to leave the Yugoslav Federation, but would have permitted the regions where Serbs formed a majority to remain in Yugoslavia, or to gain substantial autonomy. Serbs who lived in an independent Croatia would be guaranteed full citizenship and human rights protections. In the capital city of Zagreb, Croatian President Tudjman seemed reluctantly prepared to accept this compromise, which would have prevented a major military conflict. Germany, however, announced they would recognize both Slovenia and Croatia within Tito's administrative borders before the end of 1991. There would be no compromise. The Serbs were bitter that the first act of a newly united Germany would be to divide the Serbs of Yugoslavia into at least 3 separate countries. A crucial opportunity to divide Yugoslavia by peaceful means was now threatened by Germany's action.
It broke up the Constitutional Conference because once you gave 2 out of the 6 republics their independence, those 2 had no further interest in the Constitutional Conference. You had to ask the other republics whether they wanted their independence, which meant you had to ask Bosnia, and it was perfectly plain that Bosnia, there was going to be a civil war in Bosnia if you did do that.
UN Secretary-General Perez de Cuellar sent a strong letter to German leaders, warning that recognition would be a disaster. Germany and Austria's own ambassadors in Belgrade privately warned against recognition of Croatia.
The Germans risked being isolated. But the pressure from Kohl's party and from the huge lobby of Croat lobby in the southern parts of Germany, and Bavaria particularly, was such that it was difficult for Genscher to go on postponing the support.
By the time the war started, the German public had already been prepared by the repeated attacks on the Serbs in an influential German newspaper in Frankfurt. The strident commentary of Johann Georg Reismüller, which favored Croatia and reviled the Serbs, any Serbs, all Serbs, reminded Peter Handke of the way Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels once characterized the Jewish race.
It was the German press, in the form par excellence of the right-wing Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and its journalists that fundamentally influenced German policy.
German support for Croatian separatists received an unusual tribute, a musical thank you on Croatian state television. Serbian television broadcast Croatia's musical thank you, interspersed with World War II footage of cheering Croatian crowds in Zagreb welcoming Hitler's troops. All sides used propaganda, but Serbian propaganda was aimed at the Serbian population to bolster Milosevic's power base. By contrast, Croatian propaganda was designed to win international support. With the help of public relations firm Ruder and Finn, Croatia successfully used the media to manipulate a larger audience, particularly Germany and the US, to gain support for its separatist agenda. This was particularly evident in the reporting of the war around the resort town of Dubrovnik, a favorite vacation spot for German tourists. Working through its Washington PR firm, the Croatian government managed to convince much of the world that Dubrovnik was being destroyed by the Serbs in unprovoked attacks which lasted for months during the fall of 1991.
The public has been led to believe that the Federal Army attack on Dubrovnik was not precipitated by anything but sheer malice. However, on August 25th of 1991, Croatian forces attacked a base in the Bay of Kotor, on the Bay of Kotor, and they were repulsed with heavy losses.
Yugoslav troops based in Montenegro then fought their way up the coast, confronting Croatian forces near Dubrovnik.
Targets outside the old city were hit, consisting mostly of hotels which had been taken over as barracks and spotter points by Croatian forces, who also put refugees in the lower stories of their own barracks and spotter facilities.
It was obvious that the Croats were using the old town as a defensive wall. They were firing from behind hospitals. They had a mortar position next to our hotel. The final straw for me was when there was this incredible bombardment in our hotel basement. Bang, 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 bang. The worst we had ever heard. And I was furious, and everyone else was panicking. And I said to the manager who was down there with us, I said, I wish you would tell that chap with the heavy machine gun in the floor above to stop firing at the Serbs, because they're going to fire back.
Contrary to news reports, there was little damage to the historic old city.
Yes, it has been reported some 15,000 shells rained on the old city of Dubrovnik. I counted 15 mortar hits on the main street. The Yugoslav Federal Army could have destroyed the old city of Dubrovnik in 2 hours. It is not destroyed.
Washington Post reporter Peter Maas, who visited the old city several months after the fighting stopped, found Dubrovnik in what he described as nearly pristine condition.
There are many people who go to these scenes of mayhem and adventure who don't know where they are, who don't know the languages, cannot really communicate with the people, and who take press handouts from the local authorities. So there is certainly an orchestrated effort on the part of the Croatian and the Slovenian, Austrian, and German media to portray the Serbs as a bunch of howling, Byzantine, uncivilized barbarians.
The facts on the ground, however, mattered little after first impressions had been made. Rather than admit that they had made a mistake, influential columnists on both sides of the Atlantic continued to write that Dubrovnik had been destroyed. Public opinion was tilted against the Serbs and towards Croatia's political goal, recognition as an independent state. These impressions helped strengthen Germany's resolve to lead a reluctant European community to recognize the separatist republics and thereby dismantle Yugoslavia. To overcome British opposition to recognizing Croatia, German Prime Minister Helmut Kohl offered British leader John Major a deal which left Britain free to disregard or opt out of the social provisions of the 1991 treaty creating a unified Europe, which was being hotly debated in the British Parliament. This helped John Major politically at home, but Bosnia would pay a high price. The French, who needed German help to stabilize France's currency, also dropped their opposition to recognizing the separatist republics. The United States, the only power strong enough to oppose Germany, began to waver. Deputy Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, who had once served as U.S. ambassador to Yugoslavia and spoke Serbo-Croat, knew well the dangers of a wider war if recognition were extended before a settlement had been reached between the different ethnic groups.
I think the major lesson here is that when you get involved in something like this with 1,000 years of history underlying it all, you need to understand that once the dam breaks, the viciousness can be pretty awful on all sides.
In the end, here also, peace would be sacrificed for domestic politics. There was an American election coming up.
When we finally went ahead and recognized, one of the reasons we did so was because it had become a major domestic political issue for us here. We have particularly a large Croatian-American community, and Mr. Bush lost most of them in the election that he lost, because they were unhappy with our having delayed as long as we did in recognizing Croatia.
While German actions encouraged the armed secession of Slovenia and Croatia, it was U.S. diplomacy, particularly through Ambassador Warren Zimmerman, which helped light the spark for a war in Bosnia-Herzegovina by supporting Muslim leader Alija Izetbegović in his bid for a separate state.
And then we were the ones that went to the Europeans and insisted that they recognized Bosnia, and then we would recognize all three of the new states. And that was the deal that was made. And of course, it was precisely that led to the current war.
This was a war that European leaders believe could have been avoided.
The Bosnian Serbs, until comparatively recently, had been in the majority in Bosnia. And then the Muslims, who had a very much higher birth rate than the Serbs, became the predominant, the majority population. And this, of course, was something very hard for the Serbs to swallow. And they made it abundantly plain very early on that they were not prepared to accept a situation in which there was an independent Bosnia under the constitution which then prevailed. And indeed, under the constitution which then prevailed, it was illegal for Izetbegović to declare independence, because any constitutional change of that magnitude had to be agreed by all three parties.
Privately, European leaders worried about Izetbegović's close ties to Iran and the possibility of a Muslim fundamentalist state in the heart of a newly unified Europe.
Izetbegović himself had ties to the Iranians going back long before they came to power in Bosnia, really beginning not too long after the Iranian Revolution came to power in 1979.
As armed conflict swept across Croatia in the fall of 1991, a group of Muslim moderates led by Adil Zulfikar Pashic undertook an effort to prevent similar or worse bloodshed in Bosnia by entering into negotiations with Bosnian Serbs and Serbian President Milosevic.
A rather liberal-minded and assimilationist Muslim, Zulfikar Pashic, could see that the essential was to prevent them start killing each other. And he met Serbs who had precisely the same view. This could be a disaster. And they moved quite far towards agreeing on a way of sharing power so that it wouldn't collide.
Izetbegović joined the negotiations, and an agreement was ready for signing that specifically guaranteed that Bosnia would remain a unitary republic which would be given equal status to Serbia within a revamped Yugoslavia. Izetbegović seemed to indicate his acceptance, but then abruptly broke off negotiations aimed at preventing a war.
Izetbegović did what Zulfikar Pashic calls a stab in the back, because he went on television without telling Zufar Pasha he was going to do this, and accused Zufar Pasha and the Serbs who negotiated this deal of selling out and traitors to Bosnia. And this, you know, was a terribly dangerous thing to do in 91 and should have put everybody on warning against the kind of peace-loving, multi-ethnic, etc., that he and his followers were always giving towards Western journalists and Western politicians.
In his book, The Politics of Diplomacy, then Secretary of State James Baker wrote that Ambassador Zimmerman strongly advised him to recognize Bosnia. Recognition of Bosnia, however, violated the most basic diplomatic norms. For a government to be recognized, it must be in full control of its territory, it must have clearly established borders, it must also have a stable population. Not a single one of these essential conditions existed in Bosnia in February of 1992, when Zimmerman made his recommendation. U.S. intelligence analysts predicted that recognition would lead to war. Even the Germans thought that recognition of Bosnia would be a serious mistake.
Nein, es hat eine Meinungsverschiedenheit gegeben.
We did have some different opinions in early 1992, as the Americans supported the recognition of Bosnia, whereas we, the Europeans, believed that we should first establish a framework for the whole region.
So basically the policymakers ignored the analysts, and by late January, early February, U.S. policy had come around to the view that we would recognize Bosnia, and we wanted the Europeans to recognize Bosnia along with us. So from mid-February on, we were pushing the Europeans hard to recognize Bosnia, and we were thinking about how we would do that and have the U.S. recognize Croatia and Slovenia at the same time.
With American support, recognition of a separate Bosnian state was now inevitable. Lord Carrington tried to avert disaster by appointing Portuguese President José Coutinho to find common ground among the Serbs, Muslims, and Croats before an independent Bosnia was recognized.
I asked him to go to Sarajevo and to Lisbon and to have talks about with the three parties in Bosnia to see whether or not some agreement could be reached with a unitary state. I mean, an independent Bosnian state, but in some sort of federal idea in which you've got the three communities to agree.
The Bosnian Serbs, Croats, and Muslims all signed the pact known as the Lisbon Agreement on March 18, 1992. This set up a central government of Bosnia-Herzegovina and 3 ethnic cantons on the model of Switzerland.
It was the last chance, I think, of trying to preserve Bosnia before the war broke out in earnest.
If the Lisbon Plan had been adopted, British author and BBC journalist Misha Glenny wrote later, the war in Bosnia probably would not have happened. But 2 days after signing it, following a meeting with American Ambassador Warren Zimmerman, Izetbegovic changed his mind and disavowed his signature.
Izetbegovic turned around and reneged, as he's reneged on other things.
Zimmerman later acknowledged to David Binder of the New York Times that Izetbegovic had reluctantly signed the agreement to gain European recognition. More than a year after the bloodshed began in Bosnia, Zimmerman also admitted that the Lisbon Plan was not bad at all, but recalls telling Izetbegovic, if you don't like it, why sign it?
Zimmerman told Izetbegovic, look, why don't you wait and see what the U.S. can do for you, meaning we'll recognize you and then help you out. So don't go ahead with the Lisbon Agreement, don't accept the Coutinho plan, and just hold out for some kind of unitary Bosnian state. So this is a major turning point in our diplomatic efforts.
The American administration made it quite clear that they thought that the proposals, the Coutinho and my proposals, were unacceptable.
With no agreement amongst the Muslims, Serbs, and Croats, and with all sides mobilized for war, the European community voted, as the U.S. insisted, to recognize Bosnia on April 6th, along with Slovenia and Croatia. This act, Roger Cohen of the New York Times later wrote, was as close to criminal negligence as a diplomatic act can be. Indeed, international recognition and the outbreak of the Bosnian War were simultaneous. The world put light to the fuse. warring sides in Bosnia, the Serbs, Muslims, and Croats, fought for their own survival in 1992, Western countries sought political advantage by allying themselves with different factions.
Outside, individual countries have been playing sides and therefore escalating the nationalist competition within.
A war which could have been avoided in the first place would thus be prolonged, with more bloodshed, suffering, and refugees. When the fighting erupted in 1992, the UN mission in Sarajevo, known as UNPROFOR, was given the thankless task of bringing the warring parties together in some form of compromise. But the UN's attempt to be the honest broker was repeatedly undermined by the competing agendas of its own members, particularly the United States, which pressured NATO into supporting Bosnia's ruling Muslim faction, headed by Alija Izetbegović.
The United States, for reasons that are not entirely clear, has always been the very dogged champion of the Izetbegović Islamic faction within Bosnia. Britain, France, and Russia had always tended towards Serbia. The Germans, of course, had always been supportive of the Croats. If the various European interests had been allowed to govern in Bosnia, I think it's very clear it would have eventually led to some sort of an arrangement between the Serbs and the Croats, which would have ended, I think, with a minimum of bloodshed.
With strong support from the United States and Middle Eastern countries, however, Izetbegović had a clear interest in prolonging the war, in the hope that the West would intervene on his behalf.
And I think the American support, insofar as he's had that kind of support, has been to please their clients in the Middle East. I think that insofar as Izetbegović does hope to internationalize the war, which is his only chance of keeping it going, and he has an interest in keeping it going, and I think depends on continuing this Middle Eastern support.
U.S. intelligence was aware that since the middle 1980s, Iran had been training 250 Bosnian Muslims each year.
Iran has a number of strategic objectives in Bosnia. Part of that is getting an Islamic state firmly established in Western Europe.
The Sarajevo regime headed by Alija Izetbegović is a radical Islamic regime that is tied closely to the Iranians and other radical Islamic elements. You see, for example, in the person of Osama bin Laden, who is a Saudi but has been resident in Sudan, also in Afghanistan, who's the international nature of this radical Islamic movement, which is very supportive of the Izetbegović regime, to which he, in fact, is a member, a component.
But the State Department, in both the Bush administration and the incoming Clinton administration, brushed aside these concerns early in the war. It was not until 1996 that NATO leaders, worried about their own troops' safety, raided terrorist training camps in Bosnia run jointly by the Iranians and the Bosnian government.
It's an abomination. There are clearly terrorist training activities. These weapons here, in particular this plastic child's toy with plastic explosives and a detonator inserted in it, it has direct association with people in the government.
At the outset of the war, the U.S. was promoting the Sarajevo government as a multi-ethnic democracy.
The Clinton posture, as is clear to any observer, has always been based on two themes. So one is that the Sarajevo regime is a democratic, multi-ethnic democracy. And the second one is that it is the victim of aggression by Serbia, tentatively by the Croats if they get too obstreperous, but primarily by the Serbs.
Long-time observers found this description of Izetbegović's government and his SDA party misleading. The Bosnian presidency was supposed to rotate on a yearly basis, first to Serbian and then to Croatian leaders. But the fighting allowed Izetbegović to claim emergency powers for himself and his party, the SDA.
It's a wartime emergency government. I mean, by the constitution that's still technically valid in Bosnia-Herzegovina, he should have ended his presidency in December 1992. He's claiming that war emergency allows him to stay on, but not even that is exactly according to that constitution.
Contrary to statements by the U.S. State Department, Izetbegović rejected a multi-ethnic Bosnia in his book, The Islamic Declaration, written in 1970, where he states, there can be neither peace nor coexistence between the Islamic religion and non-Islamic social political systems. Izetbegovich's defenders claimed that he had modified his views, but in fact, the Islamic Declaration was officially reprinted in time for the 1990 election campaign without any changes.
The administration must be aware of that, and their protestations about the democracy and human rights and multi-ethnicity of that regime are patently absurd, and they know it.
Izetbegovich further identified himself with extremist views in 1990 when he gave an interview to a magazine which celebrated Muslim World War II collaboration with Nazi Germany. The cover of the magazine pictured Serbian leaders with severed heads.
There are no Croats or Serbs visible in that Izetbegovic government with any real authority. The Bosnian army, as it calls itself now, is mainly Muslim, Muslim manned, Muslim officered.
I don't want to give you the impression that I think all the people who are fighting on Izetbegovic's side in this army are all of them fighters of the Holy War and Mujahideen. They're not. I think that a great many of them just feel, they belong in Sarajevo and they're appalled by the attacks that have had during the war against Sarajevo. And there are lots of young people who really genuinely believe they're fighting for a society in which all Bosnians can live together, and genuinely are multi-ethnic. But they are fighting in a cause which is to make Izetbegovic president of the whole of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is not a Muslim country. It's mainly Christian, as you know. If you put the Serb Orthodox and the Catholic Croats together, you have a majority, an absolute majority. And it's ridiculous that it should be Izetbegovic's under Izetbegovic's undivided sovereignty.
Instead of reaching out to potential allies and presenting their case to remain as part of Yugoslavia, the Bosnian Serbs relied on their initial advantage in weaponry to pursue a military victory.
I think it's a civil war. I think everybody in what was Yugoslavia has a case of a sort. I think you can make a case out for the Serbs, you can make a case out for the Bosnians, you can make a Muslims, you can make a case out for the Croats. But the difficulty is that they all were so extravagant in what the reactions to what all the others did.
The Muslims have been represented as the victims and the Serbs as the aggressors. It should be remembered, however, the first blood shed in the struggle was Serb blood. 2 Muslim gunmen and 1 Croat stalked a Serb Orthodox wedding party in the heart of old Sarajevo. The father of the groom was killed. The Orthodox priest was wounded.
The killing of Nikola Gardovic on March 1st was a prelude to the war in Sarajevo. Despite promises from the government, the killers, who were well known, were not arrested. The following day, roadblocks were set up by both Muslims and Serbs. Unable to protect their civilian population, Serbs began to insist that predominantly Serbian areas of the city be controlled by their own police, or that Sarajevo become a UN protectorate. Muslims insisted on the Izetbegovic government's right to control not only Sarajevo, but all of Bosnia. To get the West to intervene, they needed to persuade Western public opinion that the Serbs were aggressors.
If you know the history, which most reporters don't know, you can very easily see them as the aggressors.
And the American press corps, the diplomatic corps, and also the foreign correspondents themselves are heavily influenced by what is said and what is done in Washington, D.C. What the State Department says is the most important thing.
In his autobiography, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker says that he instructed his press secretary, Margaret Tutwiler, to help Bosnian Foreign Minister Haris Silajdžić utilize Western mass media to build support in Europe and North America for the Bosnian cause.
But at the Times and the Post, and at the networks, big TV networks, there was clearly a pro-Bosnian Muslim bias. They were buying much of what the Bosnian Muslims said, and they were egging their reporters on because it made a better story. It's a simpler story if it's a Serb Holocaust against the Muslims than if it is a civil war with atrocities on both sides. Even if we find out when there's a real reckoning of what happened, that a preponderance of, or a higher proportion of the atrocities were committed by the Serbs, it doesn't mean it wasn't a civil war. It doesn't mean that there weren't two sides of the story.
This is part of our history, it's part of our culture, it's promoted by the entertainment industry, and so in the scene of Bosnia we had to have a good guy and a bad guy, and we like to have a victim. So it was very easy there to say, wait a minute, the Muslims are the victims, the Serbs are the bad guys, and the Croatians are kind of the good guys because they're like us and so on.
There was a sense that some of their reporting was censored to a certain line which was anti-Serb, as opposed to actually trying to create balance of what the Bosnians were doing at the same time.
The press would have us believe that the Serbs have seized 2/3 of Bosnia. The fact is the Serbs have lived in that territory for 1,500 years. Another fact is they are farmers and they are spread all over the landscape, so they have always been on 2/3 of the landscape.
The statement that has become an absolute cliche that the Serbs have taken over 70% of Bosnia. Again, the underlying assumption is that there were no Serbs in Bosnia before the conflict started, when in reality much of the land of Bosnia was Serb land before the fighting ever began. But the implication is that the Serbs dropped in from some other planet and just took over nearly 2/3 of the country.
Based on what he now calls highly biased reporting, Kenny became a hardline critic of the Bosnian Serbs, whom he considered aggressors. In an influential opinion column in the New York Times, Kenny and U.S. Air Force General Michael Dugan argued that Bosnian Serbs should be bombed by NATO.
I personally was responsible for perhaps one of the most important things that the State Department did, labeling what was going on ethnic cleansing. I had tried to gin up public opinion, and part of my job was to draft material for the spokesman, Margaret Tutwiler. And she was always looking for inflammatory material. But in any case, my colleague in Belgrade sent me a cable one day saying the Serbs were doing what they described as ethnic cleansing. I thought, okay, this is great. I'll put this into Margaret Tutwiler's noon briefing. And to my surprise, no senior official took the words out.
The aggressors and extremists pursue a policy, a vile policy of ethnic cleansing.
From that point on, the term ethnic cleansing entered public discourse, but it was not in use before. And I think that that image somehow stuck, and then further down the road, people tried to convert that into an image of genocide, which doesn't really correspond to reality.
The reality was that all sides had been carrying out ethnic cleansing since the beginning of the war.
And there's ample evidence that that's going on in all sides. It's going on in the United Nations protected areas. It's going on in the areas of Bosnia.
Media perceptions influenced policies in Western countries towards Bosnia in ways that widened and prolonged the conflict. The one force capable of keeping order in Bosnia might have been the Yugoslav army, based in Sarajevo, which had the officers, men, and equipment to counter the many militias, Serb, Muslim, and Croat, that formed in the spring of 1992. General Kadijevic tried to do just that in meetings with leaders of all sides. However, under the threat of sanctions and pressed by the U.S., the JNA was forced to demobilize. In Sarajevo, most of the heavy weapons fell into the hands of Serbian forces, while in other areas, Croats and Muslims inherited JNA weapons in armament factories. Instead of a standing army which could be held accountable for keeping order, a lightly armed force of UN peacekeepers was given the nearly impossible mandate of separating the warring sides. UN General Louis Mackenzie criticized Serbian forces for their use of heavy artillery in areas of Sarajevo, but he also wrote later that most of the 19 ceasefires he had negotiated were broken by Muslim forces because their policy was and is to force the West to intervene.
There was an obvious short-term advantage in perpetuating the fighting in some areas in order to encourage the world to intervene. I don't think that's an illogical deduction at all, and I think most people would agree with that.
The fighting in Sarajevo was described by news organizations as a siege, but the reality was that of a divided city with front lines that changed little in the course of the war. Serbs fired from areas they held into areas controlled by Muslims, while Muslim forces fired into areas controlled by Serbs.
And I think people don't really understand that, in fact, Serbian community in Bosnia suffered in exactly the same way that the other two communities suffered.
Veteran military correspondents, such as Colonel David Hackworth of Newsweek, observed that with 300 tanks at their disposal, quote, taking out Sarajevo would be easier than sliding down a greased pole. General Mackenzie agreed that the Serbs could have captured the city in a matter of days early in the war, if that had been their intention.
Bearing in mind the ex-JNA equipment that was there, and the, as admitted by the presidential side, the overwhelming superiority in gunnery and in tanks that was available in Lukovica, then certainly a very formidable assault could be made against the city with a fairly good chance of success.
Many observers wondered why a government under siege would shell its own airport.
On several occasions, the UN documented and reported and made clear publicly 2 or 3 days later that there were cases where the Bosnians had been mortaring into areas where you wouldn't expect them to be mortaring, like the airport.
In his book, Balkan Odyssey, Lord Owen wrote that Muslim forces, quote, would from time to time shell the airport to stop relief flights, to focus world attention on Sarajevo.
Sarajevo became, after all, a sort of icon of the problems of Bosnia because there was a satellite dish which was shipped in very early on in the crisis. It was easy, if you like, to have ready access to the war on a day-by-day, real-time, instant, minute-by-minute basis, if possible.
And what was going on in Sarajevo was somewhat posturing for the international media. Whether we like it or not, the presence of CNN, ITV, BBC, and the Sky News Network and many others, it was an intimidating factor for any military operation going on in Sarajevo that would be seen by the world, and the world would pass judgment based on what was going on in Sarajevo. As a soldier, it probably made a lot of sense to tie up the media in Sarajevo, and then whatever your objectives were in the rest of Bosnia could be done without the presence of the media.
The first serious atrocities in Bosnia took place outside the capital before fighting in Sarajevo began. The first massacre of the war, which was carried out on March 26th in Sjekovac near Bosanski Brod in northern Bosnia, was ignored by Western news organizations. Interestingly, the slaughter of 5 Serbian families and the burning of the village by Croatian forces was reported by the pro-government Sarajevo newspaper Oslobođenje. A week later, on April 2nd, Croatian forces captured the town of Kupres in central Bosnia. After the town was recaptured, Serbian television offered footage of Serbian soldiers and civilians who had been mutilated to Eurovision in Geneva for worldwide transmission. But they were turned down by officials in Geneva who said they already had the story from the Croatians.
The Serbs have been fragmented in their response to the media. They were hampered in the first instance by the fact that the television uplinks were in Sarajevo and Zagreb, and they were not able to get their message out in the first stages of the breakup of Yugoslavia. But since then, they were slow to learn how to use the Western media.
In a murky, complicated, violent situation, it's a lot easier for a lazy reporter or a lazy editor to get it from the press agents. And the Bosnians had a better press operation, pure and simple.
Reports of Serbian atrocities in cities such as Prijedor in northern Bosnia and Zvornik on the Drina River were broadcast repeatedly in Western countries. Meanwhile, the Serbian population of Mostar, the capital of Herzegovina, was virtually eliminated in violent attacks by combined Muslim and Croatian forces in June of 1992. But with the exception of the British Guardian, this event went unnoticed in the West.
Mostar presented an enormous problem because it was even more dangerous than Sarajevo. In fact, there are many in the United Nations and those observers within Bosnia who say that the situation in Mostar was far worse than Sarajevo, if that's possible. It almost seems hard to imagine.
Some of the worst atrocities were undertaken by Muslim paramilitary units in eastern Bosnia against Serbian villages such as Kamenica and Milici. Bloody Serbian reprisals in Srebrenica made international headlines in 1995, but for the first 3 years of the war, Srebrenica was the stronghold of Muslim warlord Nasser Oric, who drove out the Serbian population and carried out scores of massacres against surrounding villages, including the killing of 500 Serbian civilians on Orthodox Christmas Eve in 1993.
Serb public relations was so poor that they weren't doing what they needed to do to get Serbs on television. They needed to hire a Washington PR firm, the way the Muslims did, or a New York PR firm, and get their people on the air. They didn't do it. So partly it's a mechanical failure on the part of the Serbs, but of course partly it's a refusal by the networks and by the big newspapers to acknowledge that there was another point of view.
Reporters in Bosnia have largely been based in Sarajevo. There's very few that have gone into the Serb areas and spent any time in Serb areas, and that's considerably biased their reporting as well.
When news did emerge from the fighting in the Bosnian countryside, it was sometimes dangerously misleading. Brutal conditions in 2 Serbian-run prison camps, Omarska and Karaterm, were brought to public attention in early August of 1992 by Newsday reporter Roy Gutman. Gutman would later win a Pulitzer Prize for his work. But his use of the term death camps was unjustified in the view of Holocaust historian Simon Wiesenthal and a number of other journalists.
When the first stories came out about concentration camps, we really knew no more than the press had indicated. But then the State Department didn't make an effort to go and independently verify what had happened. So we were really left with this impression of mass killing, which turns out in retrospect to have been quite incorrect.
Roy Gutman's journalistic standards and use of second-hand witnesses was questioned in a well-documented investigative article by journalist Thomas Deichmann in the German publication Die Woche. Much of Gutman's information came from Jadranka Cigelj, a Croatian woman from Prijedor. Cigelj was an official of a German-based front group for a variety of neo-fascist organizations, including the German Nationalist Party and the present political arm of the old World War II Ustashi. Jadranka Cigelj's accounts of rape and mayhem by Bosnian Serb forces attracted much media attention in the West, including from ABC anchorman Peter Jennings.
Omarska. There, many of the prisoners were tortured. The women were raped. One of the women was Jadranka Cigelj.
But crucial details kept changing in her accounts of events at Omarska and Prijedor.
If you look at Roy Gutman's article about her, she blames the camp commander in Omarska, a guy called Zirko Mejahic, as having raped her. And she blames tells another few names as well. But in other eyewitness reports, she accuses different Serbs having raped her in Omarska, which again raises questions about her credibility. It became clear that she tells different stories to different people, and that raised for me quite important questions about the role of the media and the question about the sources you're going to use.
The War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, which investigated these charges, came to a similar conclusion when they declined to use Cigelj to testify on events she claimed to have witnessed. Charges against the commander of Omarska were quietly dropped by the War Crimes Tribunal several years later. Several weeks after Roy Gutman's sensational articles were published, a major interagency intelligence report by the U.S. concluded that while serious abuses had taken place, there was no evidence of organized mass killing.
We can be fairly certain that there hasn't been mass killing in the concentration camps. There's just no evidence of that whatsoever.
The International Committee of the Red Cross, known as the ICRC, stated officially, quote, "Serbs, Croats, and Muslims all run detention camps and must share equal blame."
The Muslims were running camps, and the Croats were running camps, and the ICRC in that same week had a delegation going around looking at camps run by all sides, and there were abuses taking place on all sides.
Ironically, the first mention of the phrase concentration camp occurred in the New York Times 2 months earlier, referring to a Muslim-run facility near Konjic. Times reporter John Burns noted that the UN confirmed that Serbian civilians who survived a Muslim massacre were being incarcerated in a railroad tunnel. Under international pressure, the two worst prison camps, Omarska and Karaterm, run by the Serbs, were shut down in 1992 after 4 months of operation. But neither Burns nor any other Western reporters bothered to report on the brutal Muslim camp near Konjic or the Croatian camp Dretelj, where killings and atrocities were routine.
There were Serbs in camps held even after the end of the war. And there were Serbs being held in Sarajevo in horrible conditions in a drain pipe, and journalists knew about it and never wrote about it.
There is no use anybody pretending that there are innocents in this business and that there is one side that is pure white, the victims, and the other side, pure wrong, black, the aggressors. That is not the case.